I wanted to just think about, what really is hard thinking. So if I'm defining or I'm using hard thinking as a shortcut for, the plusness, what is it that I really mean? And lots of you will have seen me use this example before, so I'll use it again to make the link to it. Some of you might not. So this example of this textbook that is supposed to be, so it's a science textbook and it's supposed to be a problem-solving approach. And so if we're doing a chapter on plant and animal systems, and problem-solving, great problem-solving, strategic competence, and we're doing the human body, and the problem is to produce a diagram of the human body showing the digestive, respiratory, excretory, and reproductive systems. What's the problem? There's no problem, right? So I know some of you have talked with me about this before, so there's no problem solving there. And of course, the transforming tasks resource is a way of thinking about, well, how might we transform this? How can we take this content? How can we take this resource and actually transform it and get some thinking done that's different? And again, some of you will know that story about when we've tried this with the Year 8 classes and we've actually put the question into their hands and said, and got them to ask the what-if questions. So take this and what are your what-if questions? And there's some surface things, some not very hard thinking. And then one of the kids actually says, what if you didn't have a bum hole? And when you've got that question, now that's actually a good hard thinking question. He's got a cheeky look on his face, waiting to be told off for being, but actually it's a great question because that question, what if you didn't have a bum hole? Now the kids are actually going to the textbook, looking through, going, I wonder what would happen if you didn't have a bum hole. And they're getting to the bit where, they're looking at the small intestines and how the stuff from the small intestines gets transferred into your blood. And they're going, oh, God, that's disgusting. Oh. And so actually, they're getting better at this through doing that hard thinking. I don't think you get better at this through doing this. If you do this and you practice and I can draw this great, but I've not got any understanding. I don't see how it all links together. I've not got that relational thinking. And even in that class, what happened after the kid came up with what if you didn't have a bum hole? We had that conversation. And then there was a kid who said, oh, you'd be like a starfish. And all the other kids looked at him. Be like a starfish. Yeah, so starfish, they take the food in through the mouth and then they digest it or whatever, and then the waste, that goes back, the poo, that goes back out of the mouth again. Oh, God, that's good. But they were bringing, that's a great story to think about. All the kids that engage with that. You never get the starfish story out of this. You never get that thinking. So when we're talking about hard thinking, I'm not talking about, not the first 10 sums on the page, but the 10 sums at the end of the chapter. I'm not talking about that hard. I'm talking about the interpretation. I've heard Minister Close talk a lot about discernment. We want our kids to be discerning. And in a strange way, thinking about what would happen if we didn't have a bum hole is a form of discernment. We're getting the kids to do that judgment. A question where the answer is, it depends. And if you think about those kinds of questions, what I think you see is that we've got those kinds of questions in the general capabilities. It's a shame that the general capabilities, when they were constructed, were put outside of the learning areas. And they were kind of over here and they were an add-on. Exactly as what Guy was saying we shouldn't do. What they should have been was within all the learning areas. Because I think the general capabilities might give us a way to either think about what the plus is or enact our plus. As you know, each of the general capabilities is unpacked and has got some descriptions. And for me, it's a mess. So it's a mess because it doesn't make sense. And let me show you why it doesn't make sense. These three, and let's see how we can make sense of it. These three, literacy, numeracy, and ICT, are really interesting because if you look at because they've got these two layers. See how they've got an inner ring and an outer ring. Numeracy hasn't quite so much, but in literacy, what they've got is this inner ring and the outer ring. And so the inner ring has got stuff about knowledge. So text knowledge, grammar knowledge, and so on. And then on the outside, they've got the composing texts and the comprehending texts. And in a way, one way of interpreting this is to say that, but this composing text and comprehending text, that's where the plusness is. That's where we might be able to bring the plus out. If we focus on the inner ring entirely the content and the knowledge and know-how of literacy, we might lose what's intended in this outer ring. And again, let me show you a favourite example, so some of you will recognise this straight away again. This is from Kath Flynn, a teacher on Kangaroo Island. And Kath was working on Romeo and Juliet with her class. And so they'd done some Romeo and Juliet, and then she'd asked them, then they did an assignment, a test, whatever it was, and one of the questions was, which character in Romeo and Juliet are you most like? What 2 characteristics do you share with them? And give an example of that characteristic. So the students did that. Inner ring. It's that inner ring of the knowledge of the text and the knowledge of the characters and things. And then what she did was she took all the responses to that question and stuck them on a sheet of paper. And so each one of these boxes is one student's response to that question. So there's a whole host of responses. Let me show you one. You know, my favourite one. I'm like Romeo in many ways because we are both daring and handsome. and Kath's written, I'm glad you think so. And a story that backs him up in being daring and handsome is when he goes down to Stokes Bay, he goes rock climbing in public and just generally shows how good looking he is. So, who knew that was an answer to a question about Romeo and Juliet, right? You know. Anyway, so she's got kind of, other responses like that. And now what she said is, okay, in this assessment, she said, now let's think about what it is to be effective in English. Now what I want you to think about is the knowledge of the characters that are displayed in these responses, the understanding of the personality and the actions that have come through the text. I want to look for the skills in English and then the application of all this and putting it together in those responses. And so what she's asked them to do is to select 2 contrasting samples. So take 2 of these off this sheet, cut them out, stick them in your book, and write feedback for the students, commenting on the inner ring, the degree to which they answer the question, and the outer ring, the plus, the metacognition, the thinking about your thinking, the thinking about what it is to be effective in English. So let me scroll that up if you can't see it. So the degree to which, asking the students to respond to, the degree to which these responses have demonstrated the knowledge, understanding, skills, and application of those English skills. And so for me, you can see in lots of different ways the plusness in here, the whatever our plusness might be, the metacognition, the reflecting on the skills, the stop and think skills, some of those things, we can start to see those coming through. And so in this formative assessment, even a summative assessment, but in this assessment piece, what Kath's done is she's captured that inner ring in the literacy and almost separately, she's captured that outer ring as well. She's captured that understanding and that real comprehension of the text, but not just in terms of the content, but in terms of the development of being being effective in English. And so it may be that we could use the general capabilities as a vehicle for our plusness. The numeracy is a bit weird because numeracy, when you look at the numeracy, it's stuff. It's almost entirely stuff. And so really the numeracy needs an outer ring, which might be problem solving or reasoning. If we were to look for the plusness in the numeracy, we've got it there in those in the maths proficiencies. And so we might think about the maths proficiencies being around the content. Because if we're only doing the content, Peter Sullivan, who wrote for Monash University, who wrote the shaping paper for the maths curriculum, said that if you're not doing the proficiencies, if you're not using the content of mathematics to develop the problem solving and the reasoning, to develop that real understanding, then you're not teaching the curriculum. But the way the curriculum was constructed actually pushed us away from that. The ICT, again, is interesting because the ICT, that's got 2 rings, but they're the wrong way around. Because what it's got on the, before in the middle ones on literacy were the kind of the knowledge and know-how, the fluency, what we call fluency in maths. It was the how to do it, the mechanics of it. But the mechanics of the ICT are around the outside, managing and operating ICT. applying ethical protocols and practices when using ICT, but the investigating, the communicating, the creating with ICT, they put those in the middle. So for me, those two bands have to be the other way around. And if they are the other way around, then you can see how, this outer ring, that's the plusness, when this is on the outside. So the communicating, the creating, not sending messages, not sharing information, but really communicating using ICT. Cisco, we've been thinking about what it's going to be to be able to operate effectively in a technology environment, particularly around the Internet of Things. I've got my keys on the Internet of Things now. It's great. My phone tells me wherever they are in the world when I lose my keys. But that's a bit naive, but it really works for me. But what it's going to be effective in there, one of the characteristics of the people that they picked out is the difference between connectivity and connectedness. Connectivity and connectedness. The difference between being able to, being hooked up to the internet and then what do you do with it, the plusness of it. So the general capabilities might be one way of getting hard thinking going. And in fact, if we think about, the critical and creative thinking general capability, within that, there's these 4 quadrants. So the critical and creative thinking doesn't have an inner ring and an outer ring because it doesn't need the inner ring. It doesn't need the mechanics of it because there is no mechanics of it. It's almost all kind of plusness. And so if we look at things like, the analysing, synthesising and evaluating information, we see these sorts of actions they're expecting from the kids. I'm going to just flick through to the last one. And if I go to this one, this is the inquiring. And again, I think we've got a problem with inquiry because sometimes when we think about inquiry, we've got a kind of lockstep process that sometimes we think about what inquiry is. And these sorts of verbs and these sorts of things that we want the kids to be doing, we could interpret in a very results way. I'll tell you how to do it, you'll do it, and I'll be able to demonstrate that you can do it. Or we could do it in a results plus way. So what I want you to do for a couple of minutes is to do some hard thinking. And within this was the opportunity for the plusness to come out. If we wanted to get the kids really inquiring and doing these things, how's that results? But more importantly, how is it results plus? What might people do to keep kids into just the results part? And what might people do to get kids out of the results only and into the broad results plus, being results and the other stuff that we've been talking about, the stuff that Guy was talking about, the things that we've been talking about. Over to you for a couple of minutes. Where's the results plus in this? The point of talking about the general capabilities was to just get us thinking about the general capabilities perhaps in a different way. But the point about talking to this one was I was trying to make you feel uncomfortable. I was trying to say, get you to do hard thinking. I was trying to say, but what do you mean? It depends. And there's a whole host of it depends in this. And the point of that was, if I go back to this, the toolkit. So somebody asked me at morning tea about the toolkit, and it's an online thing that's actually developed by UK. Steve Higgins, who I talked about before, he's the kind of academic driving force behind it. It's this online resource. It's got a long URL, so I just made a shortcut URL, and that's there. The Education Endowment Foundation, not only have they produced the toolkit, and it's been translated, if you like, into Australian, they also fund projects, hundreds of millions of dollars projects in the UK around innovation in education. And they use some of these principles, some of these ideas, and they'll do calls for research. And what they found is they can't predict what's going to work and what's not going to work. It's very difficult to predict what's going to work for them. And half the things they've funded essentially haven't worked very well. Oh, oh no. But the ones that have worked have been the ones that have been co-constructed with schools and groups of schools. Those have been the ones where they're much, much more likely to work. And so this project, I think, what we're trying to do is to used you as leaders, you as innovators, to co-construct this with us. So the system's using you, and you're using the system, so that we're working together and we're collaborating on it. That's why we're not saying there's only one definition of plus and it's this. That's why we're saying find your definition, the plus, and lead that out. Develop that, work on that across your partnership. So our response to where's the hard thinking, where's the plusness in this, will depend upon our story. You know, when I was talking yesterday about the use of the data and constructing your data needs, your evidence needs, based on your story, on what you're trying to achieve, your interpretation of things like the general capabilities will depend upon your story. Because how this general capability helps you to enact the principle that you want to enact in your partnership will depend. It will be different. And you really can't have productive conversations until you're very clear about your strategic intent. Otherwise, I ask a question like I've just asked, and the danger is that we're all over the place. It's really difficult to answer, and it's too fuzzy to get into. Just wanted to pick up on going back to that idea of, so elsewhere in the world, what's the plusness? What's the general capabilities? What's the things that they're thinking about? And this is some of that research that I know some of you have seen before, so say, from UNESCO around, well, what's our plusness in the Asia Pacific region? What's the things that we can agree on that is going to be our plusness? It's not necessarily going to be reflected in our grades, but all these things are going to contribute to our grades, contribute to the development of our young people. And UNESCO have defined these things, they've called them transversal competencies, things that go across all of the learning areas, things that go across all of the age groups, things that partnerships of schools could work on from the early years right the way through primary, right into senior secondary and beyond. And so they've really focusing on that critical and innovative thinking, on interpersonal and intrapersonal skills. You know, it's the general capabilities, right? It's just reconnected in another way. And when Margot was talking earlier about, what Seaview have been doing with the non-Googleable questions, that's been a way of enacting some of this critical and innovative thinking, way of getting the kids to be discerning, as the ministers talked about. So that they're not just asking questions that are non-Googleable. They know the difference between a Googleable and a non-Googleable question. And they're able to think about that. And they're seeing that the harder thinking is the non-Googleable question and not the Googleable question. You can't be innovative. You can't use Google to be innovative. You can't go onto it and think a new thing. And when the countries across the Asia Pacific region, we each did a report, and Australia was one of them, we each did a report on what we were seeing in our curriculum documents and elsewhere that was valued. And again, it's that critical and innovative thinking, reasoned decision-making, reflective thinking, discernment. These are the things that everybody's talking about as being their plusness in the Asia Pacific region. I've told this story before, I'll say it again, but when we went to China for a UNESCO meeting, and one of the officials there got up in front of this room of thousands of people, mostly Chinese, but we've got our headsets on, so we're getting the English translation in our ears. And this person talks about how we've got this really strong culture in China, and it really works well for us, and we've got this face-saving culture, so we collaborate really well. But there's a problem because it causes our scientists and technologists to lie. What? And all the European people are looking at each other going, what? Did she just say that? What's going on? And she went on and said, because we can't be seen to be wrong. So because we can't be seen to be wrong, what we find is when our scientists try something new out and it doesn't work, they make things up. What? And then she talked about how what we've got to do is get our kids to be able to fail. They've got to be able to fail, and they've got to be able to fail productively. They've got to be able to fail and fail fast. They've got to know they're going to fail. And that's okay, because what they'll do is they'll step in and fail. And then they'll step in and expect to fail again, and they will fail. And then they'll step in and expect to fail again, and then they will fail. And then they won't fail. because they've already done the failure. They've done this productive failure. They've learned from it. So next time, they're much less likely to fail. Next time after that, they're much less likely to fail. So we've got to get our kids to be good at productive failure. And she talked about how effortful it was going to be for them as a system to get their kids to be productive failures. The Chinese kids get good at being productive failures. I think we're in trouble. Like massive trouble. Think about my kids having to compete with those kids. If they are good at productive failure, my kids are really going to be in trouble in that kind of global economy. And so, some of the work I'm thinking about, some of the particular junior primary teacher Sally Griffith from the southern region talked about her kids, how she feels like actually she has to teach them to fail. She has to actively teach them to fail, because they've got people around them who might be rescuing them and doing things for them. The kid hanging off the wall. So one of our plusness parts might be about productive failure. It might be about that innovative thinking, that then reflective thinking on those failures. And it's much easier to fail when you're doing it with other people than when you're doing it on your own. Failure in collaboration doesn't feel nearly so bad as failure on your own. And so collaboration now becomes part of being a productive failure. So all the things that we've been talking about, that critical and creative thinking, that discernment, not presentation skills, but communication skills. Not transferring information, but that connectedness that I was talking about. And that collaboration as a vehicle for that. All 10 of the countries in the Asia-Pacific region, including Australia, that agreed on some of these aspects, those are the ones that they agreed on. And so the conclusion from UNESCO, say we put in the Australian case study, but the conclusion from UNESCO was things are changing. And the way that things are changing is that we're seeing more and more of these what they've called transversal competencies, but I think in our conversation it's the plusness. And in fact, they talked about a global movement calling for the need of education to move beyond the acquisition of knowledge and literacy and numeracy skills. Of course, what they're talking about is the plusness across the Asia-Pacific region. Not losing sight of the results, but getting the plusness as well. Even in this report, they use the Australian curriculum general capabilities as an example of that plusness. And of course, in South Australia, we're the only state or territory to have the general capabilities reflected in our senior secondary curriculum. So the SACE capabilities are the general capabilities out of the Australian curriculum. We've also got a really strong early years sector and focusing on using the early years learning framework. And if I focus on the learning outcomes section of the early years learning framework, what we've got are these 5 outcomes. And this is where I was going. And if we pick out the children being confident and involved learners as one example of a learning outcome, that's what we want our kids to be, confident and involved learners. Well, what does that look like? And what this looks like in the early years learning framework is, so there's the outcome. Each outcome has got a number of components. There's a component that says the skills and processes like problem solving, strategic competence, experimenting, hypothesizing, researching in the early years learning framework. And you can see this is evident when. This is where you will find the evidence for this. This is evident when kids are applying a wide variety of thinking strategies to engage with situations and solve problems and adapt these strategies to new situations. Transfer. This could be a senior secondary descriptor. This should be a senior secondary descriptor, not an early years descriptor. This should be a descriptor all the way through from the early years, primary, high school, and post-school destinations. But very clear about, communicating mathematical ideas and concepts, and making predictions, seeing generalizations, doing some big thinking, not knowing stuff, but making generalizations, and then communicating these using mathematical language and symbols. So again, what we're seeing is that the plusness is really, really strong in the early years learning framework. I think if we're using the RRR document, we might be able to see some of these things coming through for early years people, but I don't think you necessarily will. I think my suggestion is, don't use the RRR as a substitute for the early years learning framework. Go back to the early years learning framework and see how those things are being acted when they come through. Because the really good plusness is in here. And so I just wanted to make this point here, about the other things that we've got, these other evidences, looking for the evidences, how are kids contributing constructively to mathematical discussions and arguments, and using reflective thinking to consider why things happen and what can be learnt from these experiences. None of these are early years things, right? They're not early years specific. We could think about these for any of the kids. And then think about how some of those things that we've talked about that could be our principles, the stop and think skills, the metacognition, the reasoning, all of those things, how they contribute to the early years learning framework in this case. So we've got a story, and the banana-rama principle, it ain't what you do, it's the way that you do it. You could easily see how people could just go through the motions of this and not really bring the plusness out to restrict it to just the results part. And this is where so it even says in the early years learning framework, this is evident when. This is telling you, here's your evidence. Look for things like this. Document stuff, things like this, capture this, and you have got your evidence. Just to finish that story, I just wanted to reflect on, in universities now, we've got these threshold learning outcomes. Every subject, so this is the one for engineering and ICT, has said, actually, you know what? Results isn't enough. There's some plusness. We need plusness. And every subject has been required to go through and say, what can you not graduate from an Australian university without developing? Knowledge and know-how, but what else? And every subject, so say engineering, there's geography, has had to go through and define what the plusness is. Every single one, and as we go through, that was history, performing arts has got theirs, communication, creative, critical and reflective thinking, science is there. This is the law one. So even in law we've got, reasoning and research, thinking creatively, collaborating. That plusness that we're seeing is we've actually got a story that goes all the way from the early years, through primary, through secondary, into senior secondary, and all those things are reflected in the universities as well now. And what's interesting about the universities is we're now saying, how do we teach that? How do we do that? And in fact, at Flinders in the science faculty, we've adopted a slightly modified version of TEFL. We're doing university TEFL. Because the way that we do it is the way that we're going to reflect these things, is the way that we're going to develop these things. It's not through the content and the kind of syllabus descriptions. And so we're trying to get as far away from this non-hard thinking as we possibly can. And this is a quote from a student in Port Augusta. And as I say, they've been working on shifting the maths practice and really developing their maths practice using a number of things, but one of the principles that they've held on to is about the executive functions, is about getting the kids to stop and think. And in doing so, they've been developing student voice. Because if the kids are stop and think, I want to hear their thinking. So they've heard the student voice coming through. And this has been, just to be involved in that project in a small way, this has been a really powerful thing to me and what a real proud moment of the last 12 years when a student said, maths used to be hard and I hated it. Now maths is still hard, but I like it. Almost as much as PE. The best bit of it is, maths is still hard. But what's hard has changed. It's gone from not knowing stuff to hard thinking. And the dispositional change that's come with that, and the direction of travel in terms of the intellectual engagement and that sort of development, that results plusness that we're seeing coming through in students like this. And so when we think about what's the plus, what I'm really asking is, what's your plus going to be? Let's co-construct this. If we don't co-construct it, if the department does it and tells us what the plus is going to be, it'll fail. It's got to be a co-construction. We've got to be able to work on this together. The department's got to empower you to do it, provide you with the resources to do it, provide you with the space and time to do the thinking. And that's exactly what this programme is about finding your plus and put it into action. All right, I'm going to stop. Thanks very much.